All right, part three, I guess.
All right, everybody. Welcome to a pretty
Let's see.
special live stream. I'm had the real pleasure of being joined by Dr. Dan McClellan, who has just, you know, some really amazing work dealing with the infinite mountain of disinformation about the Bible. And I really enjoyed your work, and I just was like, yeah, I really would love to get this guy on because you've done some fantastic work on the origins of monotheism, and you have some really, I think, sophisticated and powerful thoughts on all that. So, Dan, thanks for coming on Esoterica and chatting about monotheism and Yahweh.
Well, it's my pleasure. I appreciate the invitation and the very kind words, and I look forward to no doubt a stimulating conversation and hopefully some wonderful comments and questions as well.
I think we'll get some. So, Dan, could you just introduce yourself a little bit? I know that some people prefer to introduce others, but I always find that people introduce themselves best. And so, yeah, could you mind just kind of tell us who you are, what you do, and where people can find you? Because I really do want people to support your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a public scholar of the Bible and religion. My name's Dan McClellan. I live in beautiful Harriman, Utah right now. With my wife and three girls. I received a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Exeter over there. That was the name of the awarding department, but I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the cognitive science of religion, cognitive linguistics, and the conceptualization of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible, which is a mouthful. But I published that as an open access volume a couple years ago. So the PDF of that is freely available online. And a bit ago, I transitioned to doing public scholarship full time after I surprisingly met with some success trying to combat the spread of misinformation about the Bible and religion on social media, and particularly on TikTok. I saw TikTok videos being shared on Twitter and on Instagram and Facebook that had to do with the Bible, and I thought, who's in charge over there? And went and I don't know if the kids call it lurking anymore, but I lurked for a little while, and I didn't really see any credentialed experts who were posting regular content, engaging with what was going on over there. There were a bunch of kind of discernible communities. You got your deconstructionists, you got your atheists. There's some overlap between the two. You've got your apologists, you've got your conspiracy theorists. There are a lot of different groups, and I thought I would just kind of situate myself as a bit of an umpire there to call balls and strikes and not play for any given team. And it's been an incredible experience and a lot of fun. I've met some wonderful people and some very odd ducks along the way.
Yeah,
But
you can
having a
imagine how
great
odd they get around here. Yeah.
yeah. But I go by at McClellan, a phonetic spelling of my last name that I used when I was living in South America, MAKLELAN, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Threads for as long as those things will exist. And then I have a podcast that I co-host with my friend Dan Beecher called the Data Over Dogma podcast. And this has long been kind of a motto of mine that I'm going to always strive to prioritize the data over and against whatever dogmas might exist. And we release weekly episodes. We say that we're there to try to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combat the spread of misinformation about the same. And then I also teach online classes from time to time on my website, mcclellan.org. In fact, just today, I started putting together the syllabus for a biblical Hebrew class that I'll be teaching starting in August. So if anybody is interested in picking up a little bit of biblical Hebrew, that will hopefully be a wonderful opportunity. I'm looking forward to it. I've taught it for free many years ago on kind of a more limited local level, but I think it might be something a lot of people will be interested in learning. And if I can reduce the number of people who appeal to Strong's Concordance on social media on any given day, then I'll call that a win.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll say, folks, Hebrew is not as difficult as you might think. A lot of people really think that Hebrew, just because it's written in a different alphabet, is a lot harder. But I find Hebrew to be far easier than Latin or Greek, especially. It's especially biblical Hebrew. It's really,
Mhm.
it's not, it's not often it's not often terribly difficult. So, but yeah, I'd encourage folks check out Dan's contents if you want to learn Hebrew.
Hebrew is a reconstructed language. Hebrew is literally an extinct language, so they literally just reconstructed it. So I'm not really surprised that it would be so-called easier because, of course, they literally reconstructed it. So
I'm sure Dan's a great guy to teach it, and it's well worth doing. So I guess I want to open up the first question. I opened the conversation with this exact question about sort of public facing scholarship vis-a-vis this historiography business of this deity, Yahweh or Adonai or Shem, or how we want to lay it out there, the God of the Israelites, the national God of the Israelites. And one of the things I've noticed is that there's always a delay between what goes on at the AAR and the SBL, the big religion conferences, the academic conferences. That conversation's always several years ahead of where, sort of History Channel documentaries are, assuming it ever gets to there and it's not insane things. And things have trickled down. It's amazing what has trickled down. For instance, the Gospel of Thomas is well known among lots and lots and lots of people. I think many people know about the Gospel of Thomas, even though that's a relatively specialized kind of thing to know about. It's gotten some popular play. What's fascinating to me is that there's a lot of scholarship out there on the origins and the history of the Israelite national God. And I have not experienced any of that scholarship making its way even down to undergraduate classrooms. I haven't seen much in the way of that. Upper level undergraduate, right? You'll get into some of the discussion of that stuff in graduate school. It certainly happens there. But it's interesting that there's a kind of gulf there. And what I wanted to ask you and get your opinion about, and I think there's a relatively obvious answer, and maybe we can focus on that. But I was kind of thinking out loud, why do you think that hasn't happened? Why do you think that disconnect remains as strong as it is when other layers of scholarship have at some level trickled their way down? Even the Yahweh and Asherah stuff has kind of gotten some public play. So people are willing to say, God might have had a wife consort, but that this deity may have evolved or not have originally come from Israel as a nation or whatever. Any sense of why that disconnect?
I think I can see two different reasons that probably influence that that fact to different degrees. And I think the more obvious one, well, at least for me, the more obvious one is that I think there are a lot of sensitivities to that kind of thing. I think for a lot of people that is a pretty significant strike against their faith and their faith community. And so I think there are a lot of people who are a little loath to engage with that kind of thing. For me, at least, I know when there's a question within the Christian community that I get, I get into a lot of trouble with. Like I say a lot of stuff on social media, and I get all kinds of different pushback. But as soon as I start talking about Jesus not being God, like the pushback amplifies tenfold. I think there are a lot of folks who think that strikes at the heart of at least their understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And I wonder that
because Jesus wasn't God. I don't understand how people don't understand that Jesus was not God. Jesus was not God, bro. Like, with that logic, we're God. What do I mean by that? We were made in the image of God, but we are our own type of people, right? Same logic. Bruh, it's not that complicated. We were modeled after God, but that doesn't mean, oh my gosh, we're suddenly God now. Like, bruh. I'm just mind blown how people just can't fathom the logic of you can literally just simply, and I explained this before, you can literally just break a small portion of yourself, and if it's no longer a part of you, and it's doing its own thing or whatever, then it's not you. I'm just simplifying it, but that's literally Jesus. It's like, bruh, you imagine you have a sponge, right, or whatever. Freaking, I don't know, man. Yeah, I'm gonna just use a sponge. Or no. Let me give a better analogy. You have a book. Yeah, this is much better. You have a book with pages in it, just like a journal book where you use to write notes in class with, right? And you simply have the pages in it, right? That's all the book, right? That's all the book. However, if I go and I tear just a piece of page from that book, we're not gonna say, oh, this ripped page now is that book. We're not gonna look at that one page, that one piece of paper, because now it's just a piece of paper, right? You see how it changed, even though it originated from the book, right? We're not gonna say, oh yeah, that one piece of paper is a whole journal. No, we're gonna say, oh, that's just a piece of paper now. Simple. Guys, it is not that complicated.
Degree to which some people think that that's just a bridge too far for engaging on in public discourse. I'm certain that that's a concern for a lot of folks. But another thing I think
I
is
don't
that
know.
you don't have a
That's
ton
mind
of
blowing to me.
like monographs treating this. Like we've had books talking about
Wow.
God's wife. Bill Deaver's book from 2005, Did God Have a Wife? I mean, it's a pretty sensationalizing title, which was Bill's thing. You know, all of his titles were questions about
Has
this, that,
archaeology
or the
buried the
other.
Bible?
Yeah, and so it's kind of reducible and digestible to the public a little more easily. But it's also the topic of an entire book. We've only just started seeing books coming out within the academy directly engaging the origins of Adonai as their own deity. So there's an edited volume that came out probably 7 or 8 years ago called The Origins of Yahwism, which is a collection of different essays. And now we've got Ted Lewis, The Origin and Character of God. We've got Daniel Fleming's book, Adonai Before Israel, Glimpses of History and a Divine Name. And another one, Adonai, Origin of a Desert God, that are, at least as far as I can remember, the first time we've had multiple monographs directly engaging that question. It's always been kind of tangential to other discussions. When you look at The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, Mark Smith's book from 23 years ago now,
right.
And even before that, we had oh gosh, I don't remember his book from. The original was from, I think, 1991, but there was a second edition that was published in 2000. That was
John Day's book?
No, Mark Smith's book.
Oh, Mark Smith. Yeah, he is. Yeah.
It's
like Origins of Biblical Monotheism, and then the early history
of God. Yeah. But didn't really deal much with theories about the origins of Adonai. It was primarily, here are the biblical texts, here's the Ugaritic literature, here's where there's overlap, and so I think to some degree it's just the fact that the scholarship has not made it has not centered it as a topic of discussion, but also it's something that I think there's a gap that exists where things have to be digested. But I also think that the things that become more popular within the public discourse are also the things that are going to serve somebody's battle lines, that are going to be strike at some identity marker or another, that are going to be controversial, that are going to be a sexy headline for an article somewhere. And I don't know that here are some speculations about where the divine name may have come from, or what nomadic group may have brought it into the Northern Hill Country. Probably just hasn't struck anyone as particularly sexy yet. But But we're gonna try to bring sexy back
Yeah,
when it comes to the
absolutely.
origins of Adonai.
And I guess it's, to me, that's like striking. I made this episode on Yahweh as basically a lark. And as folks know, I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm a tourist in that world. I have a MA in religious studies. I read the literature, but I would never claim to be a scholar of the Bible, something like that. I'm not. Um, but it was the kind of thing where I was thinking, like, fascinating that this entity has become basically God for billions of people, and yet we don't have like the origin story episode. There's no like episode 0 where we learn the backstory of Yahweh in the literature. And I was like, what is the literature? Where does the literature sort of stand at this point? And I made the episode, and it was fascinating. The comments I got were, so many people were like, I have never heard any of this, and I've never heard about any of these books existing. Like, what is this? And,
Wow.
to me, it just shows like, oh wow, there's a disconnect, and there's an interest.
Yeah.
There is an interest in that, and of course, why wouldn't there be? This is ostensibly the deity worshipped by billions of people, and I think that when we point out the fact, oh yeah, we don't know really much about where this being came from a purely historiographical point of view, archaeological point of view. It's interesting. We know far more about, I don't know, almost any given Egyptian god.
Yeah. Yeah.
Than we
We
Yeah, literally last night. This video is usually gonna be uploaded like a good couple days later, but last night, from the date that I am pre-recording this video, I was editing the video of the origins of Yahweh, and my mom asked me, "Oh, what type of video are you making, or what type of video are you reacting?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I'm just doing the origins of how did Yahweh become God." I was like, "It's a very fascinating video," and she said, "What?" She's like, that doesn't that doesn't sound right." I'm like, well, that's literally what God was originally. There's literal historical, archaeological evidence to show this. And freaking, like, long story short, it just turned into like a big debate and argument. Because then she went to my brother, the one that I always say, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna freaking he's gonna be like reacting to some videos." He's gonna I already told him. I'm like, you gotta react to this video. I said, when you get your PC, if you want the update on that, his PC is almost done. His PC is almost done. So that's the update on that. His friend is building his PC for him, and then he's gonna ship it over because his friend lives in a whole different state. But so that's the update on that. And he was like, based on the Bible that I read, I'm like, bro, it's not just the Bible too. Like, I'm like, there's more nuance to it than just that. I said the modern Bible that you're reading from, it gives you something completely different. Not completely, but like there's a big gap between like the destruction of Jerusalem from the Neo-Babylonian Empire and how it completely transformed, you know, the Abrahamic, like, you know, you had the ancient Israelites and what they worship, and then you had the modern, you know, Abrahamic religion, which is like the Jewish faith, you know, Islam. The fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem would pave way to Judaism. So I'm like, bro, like what you're reading from is not the whole picture. You gotta go even deeper than that. But anyways, I'm not really gonna talk too much about that here because that's gonna, yeah, it's gonna make for a good reaction.
certainly have a lot more publications, a lot more accessible stuff about. Then they were conflated with this deity, and then this was the city that they were in, and then we have the temple to this deity, and but yeah, there's it's shrouded in mystery to some degree, even though we have some of these tantalizing hints. Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9 is one of, I think, the most fascinating and enigmatic passages in the Hebrew Bible. And then one of the first things I ever read in the Bible, I didn't grow up religious. I think I was 12 or 13 the first time I ever cracked the spine on a Bible, and that was because I was waiting for my mom to finish rehearsing for some nativity play that she happened to be a part of, and I was stuck in a chapel, and I opened up a Bible and kind of flipped around. I spent like an hour just poking around in a Bible, and I came upon Exodus 6:3. And it was like, I made myself known, or I was known to your fathers as El Shaddai, but by my name. And then in the English translation as the Lord, Adonai, the Tetragrammaton. I did not make myself known to them, or I was not known to them, or something like that. And I was like, wait a minute. I'm pretty sure I saw that
Right.
small cap's name a bunch of times in the chapters that I was just flipping through. And so, like, it's just kind of sitting on the surface. There's something going on here with the relationship of these deities to each other, which raises the question of where on earth does Adonai really come from?
Right, and that's sort of, maybe that's a way in, right? We have these are two interesting passages where it reveal clearly that there's at least maybe a manuscript that one writer had that this deity was absent from, and maybe gets reinterpolated back in by another writer. Who knows? We don't know exactly what that editorial process looked like. But then we have other passages, like in Deuteronomy, like you mentioned, where there's clearly that Yahweh is a subordinate deity, that El Shaddai, or an El, is parceling out land, and Yahweh is getting some of it, specifically the portion in Israel. And I also remember as a young person reading that section particularly and being like, what is this? Or some of the Psalms that are relatively archaic, where there's a divine council situation happening, and and you're like, what? This is not a monotheism that I have, sort of God alone in the dark of space conjuring things from nothing. That is not what you get when you read these texts.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's a place to start, is
Yeah, that's literally what the whole argument was that I was just talking about with my family, like, because that's literally how they were thinking. They were like, wait. Like, God was originally just a storm warrior god amongst other gods. They're like, what? Like, what? Like, the idea of that is just inconceivable, just very narrow-mindedness. But yeah, literally what he just described there is exactly how they were thinking. Like, it just could not imagine that, bro.
what are some of the theories that you find compelling about sort of the origin of this being? Because we find the being in Tanakh, we find it in media res. We find layers of this entity's evolution sitting right next to each other, where in some cases perhaps we have archaic layers where this deity is a subordinate deity, then other cases where the deity has kind of become the national god of Israelites, but still existing alongside other deities. I think when the text says, Micha Mocha Baalim Yahweh, like it's not asking a rhetorical question. It's who is like this God among the gods? It's
Yeah.
not a rhetorical question. It's actually like, yeah, there are other gods out there. And so from that point of view, what, and you've done some speculation in your own writing. What sort of, what speculation feels like it has something there? And
Yeah.
again, to admit to folks, this is speculating at some level, but where do you find yourself in that field of speculation?
Well, the first thing that attracted me to this study, because my first master's degree at Oxford, my thesis was on anti-anthropomorphism and text criticism of the Septuagint. I was interested in conceptualizations of God, but from a kind of Second Temple Jewish Septuagint textual criticism perspective. And then for my second master's thesis at Trinity Western University in lovely Langley, BC, I wanted to work on the threshold of monotheism. When do we first see monotheism? But I couldn't get past the question of what a god was. I was just not.
Which is hilarious to me because my same brother literally was telling me how he believes that there is a council. Like, I don't know, man.
Satisfied by the answers I was finding, and one of the things that made me decide I was going to pivot to looking at conceptualizations of deity is that I kept seeing two different kind of divine profiles in the text. There's this notion of God as kind of an aged, patriarchal, wizened, benevolent, sitting on a throne deity. And then there's this other youthful warrior deity associated with inclement weather and thunderclouds and things like that. And both of these profiles line up pretty neatly with divine profiles from the broader Northwest Semitic pantheon. We have El, the patriarchal high deity, who we know from the Ugaritic literature. And then we have Baal, this youthful storm deity who's associated with inclement weather. And it seemed to me that, like you said, we seem to have kind of the juxtaposition of early and late layers. But it seems to me that more often than not, the earlier layers that are associated with El or El Yon tend to represent the god as this aged, wizened, patriarchal deity, whereas the representation of Adonai as, or the representations of the deity known as Adonai tend to accrete around this youthful storm deity, the charioteer of the clouds, the rider of the clouds, the one who comes forth from Seir, from Sinai, and does battle. And I've heard a bunch of different interpretations of what's going on here. They're emphasizing different features, different aspects of God's personality or God's nature. But the fact that they align so conveniently with these deities from different tiers of the pantheon struck me as a little too convenient. And so it seems to me, and when we throw Deuteronomy 32:8-9 into the mix, where Adonai is given their inheritance as Israel, and a lot of people say, no, they just kept Israel for themselves. You don't hand out an inheritance to yourself. That doesn't make a ton of sense. But also, this seemed to me to perhaps be rationalizing why we see Adonai limited geographically to the land of Israel in a lot of the earlier layers of the Hebrew Bible. Naaman says, when I'm back worshiping alongside my master in the temple, I want to worship Adonai, who seems to be the deity you can only worship on Israelite soil. So he takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him. He's going to take a piece of the land with him so he can worship the deity from that land. David tells Saul, your men are forcing me to worship other gods by running me out of Adonai's inheritance. In other words, I can't worship Adonai if I am in the purview of another deity. I think there are so many different representations of that limitation to Adonai's sovereignty, and I think one of the most fascinating ones, one that I think is so much fun, but a lot of people really hate when I talk about, is 2 Kings 3, where Adonai leads this Judahite, Israelite, Edomite coalition into Moab to basically try to run a scorched earth campaign because Moab has thrown off vassalage. And then Adonai gets run off. And it seems to be because Adonai lost home court advantage. And Chemosh was invoked by the sacrifice of the king's son. And basically, in my opinion, the prophecy fails. And I think this is the author probably kind of in an embarrassed way, just trying to write it off as, well, this is why this happened, because God was, out of pocket. And
that's the first time we see the phrase Yahweh Yotev of Hey on the Misha Stele is them bragging about the fact that Chemosh defeated Yahweh, and they drug ritual objects before the shrine for Chemosh.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting that, again, I tell people the first time that Yahweh definitively enters history, and not in some ambiguous Yahweh of the Shasu, but like
Mhm.
definitely we know who it is. It's in defeat.
Yeah.
It's in a military. It's in a military humiliation. So this God does not enter into history. Ironically enough, enters into history in Tanakh as a kind of warrior God, defeating everybody. But in actual archaeological history, the Merneptah stele is a stele of defeat, and
Mhm.
the Mesha stele is also a stele of theological defeat. And so it's if that's your origin story, you're not coming out swinging. But that is what we have in the archaeology.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
it's kind of similar to the idea of the Spartans that we have of, we represent them as the ultimate, toxic masculinity guys that are always out there winning, and the reality is was they got their asses handed to them over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That's such a good analogy to point out, man. It's like, and people are just fed like the wrong thing, and they, like their whole lives, bro. And like the moment that something um new is shown to them, they're like, whoa, 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 you know what I mean? Like, no, that's impossible. I had people look at me and, tell me like, oh my gosh, like you are so open-minded. Like I actually like the fact you are so open-minded. You don't just sit here and, just not listen to something that doesn't fit your narrative or whatever, right? And now why am I talking about this, number one? Well, simply put it, like I said before, the argument that literally freaking happened last night, it relates to that. There, you need to ask yourself this question, right? Why am I so open-minded, right? How is it that I'm able to be so open-minded? And I don't know who's watching this. I'm guessing other open-minded people are watching this as well. Um, the reason why I am so open-minded is literally, I said this in plenty of my videos, okay, that there are like 99% of history that we know, we don't know. We don't know 99% of history. Literally 99% of history is lost to us. Literally. So with that logic in mind, where 99% of history is literally lost to us, and the history that we think, especially ancient history, okay, let me reiterate that. Let me rephrase that. Ancient history, okay? Because modern history is like, yeah, we have the internet now, blah, blah, blah. Nah, bro. I'm talking like ancient history, bro. Okay? Like all like BC, early, I would say up until literally up until the 20th century. Well, yeah, yeah, I would say up until the 20th century, because 20th century, 21st century, because even when we were like deciding that, hey guys, we need to really and truly keep these documents safe, um we only remember history throughout like that period from like rich people. Remember when I said that? We only remember history through the lens of rich people, because remember, poor people couldn't read and poor people couldn't write. For a long time, poor people could not do that, right? So, even then, it's like a lot of history that they would also know, especially from their perspective, is lost to us. So, really and truly, most of the history that we do know is literally just from rich people. And ancient history is 99% lost. That is a fact. So, whenever I come on here and, I hear these new details of, oh, you know, you learn about this like this, but new evidence or new clear documents that have been discovered have shown that it was actually like this. I'm like, okay. I'm like, okay. Because really and truly, there is so much lost to time that who the hell am I to say that's not right? That's why I'm always open-minded when it comes to stuff like this, because it's like I'm aware that most of the stuff that we know, just I could honestly just say what we think we know about history, especially ancient history, is probably wrong. Like, yeah, we have some details, but not the. We don't have the. We have a piece of the puzzle, quite literally. We have a piece of the puzzle, and that's it, bro. We don't have the whole puzzle piece together. We don't, and we never will, unfortunately. So I don't know. I don't know why people just can't like just realize that yeah, we don't have everything. So when new details are coming out, it's like you should be open to that. You should be open and sit down and hear it. New details of something that we've never heard before. That's probably true. But no, instead, people are fed, people are just fed something throughout their whole lives and they just get accustomed to it. And then when these new details come, they're like, oh, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound right. What? That's not what I've been hearing my whole life. And I said, why are you so narrow-minded? It blows my mind how narrow-minded, like, a lot of people are.
And did not do
Heroically,
so.
though.
Yeah.
Yeah, they died. They died heroically.
Yes, but they kept dying,
they-
and we all go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask about the Mount Seir stuff, but finish your thought, please.
Oh, I was just going to say and we see Yahwistic theophoric elements in some of the names that are listed in the Teldan Stele, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which are also about defeat and subjugation. We have the actual bas relief depicting Jehu bowing before Shalmaneser.
The only time in historical record an Israelite king is depicted, it's him bowing in defeat.
Yeah.
If you were to tell the story, if we had no Tanakh and just had the archaeology, I often tell people, build your theology from that, and what do you end up with? You're not going to get anything like a monotheistic God creating the world from nothing, ruling over everything.
Oh yeah.
You're not going to get that God at all. But I wanted to go back to the Mount Seir thing, because this is sort of the question that, the origin question. Is this God emerging from that region? Because those mentions of Mount Seir are in texts in the Hebrew Bible for which the Hebrew is quite archaic. It's some of our most archaic strata of the Hebrew Bible. And one thing that I've done when I've taught some of this material, and I wonder what you think about it, is that I've tried to extract just those sections of relatively archaic text from the Psalms, some text from the Song of Devorah, the Song of the Sea, and just sort of make a collection of those. And then just read those. I have my students just read those and be like, okay, what God is here? Right? Just like
what Israel is there too.
Exactly.
The Israel is very different as well.
Absolutely. And I wonder, do you think that that's a methodologically interesting or revealing thing to do? Because I find it when I first learned that there's a stratigraphy to the Hebrew Bible, that like the Song of the Sea is so archaic that like the definite article hasn't totally developed yet, or something, weird stuff like that. That you're like, yeah, this is like different enough Hebrew that a Hebrew reader can tell it's something. It's not quite analogous to, Beowulf English to Chaucer's English, but it's something like that is going on. It's noticeable.
Yeah.
And but I don't know. Do you have any sense when you read those sections, and if you read them in sort of isolation, is it revelatory for you at all about the potential origin of this being?
I think we do get a sense that the deity is not native to the land, that it's or the deity's kind of fortress of solitude is outside of their inheritance. It does seem, if you isolate those passages and then try to use them as a foundation for reconstructing what Yahwism in those time periods would have been like. It is a very idiosyncratic picture. It is unlike the more developed systematic picture that we get a little later in the Hebrew Bible. There have been arguments about the degree to which we can use language to date texts, and there have been arguments that some of these texts might date to much later. There are scholars who have gone back and forth about that kind of thing. I do think that it probably preserves some kind of early memory of an Adonai and an Israel that is not yet the main character of the narratives that we have from the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And I also think if we consider the fact that we don't have narrative prose within alphabetic languages until the Mesha inscription and literature after that. So second half of the 9th century BCE is when we seem to develop narrative prose within alphabetic text, alphabetic languages, or writing anyway. All we would have from before that would be poetry. And so it seems like we have kind of larger poetic units with fragments of very, very early poetry embedded within them. So I when we look at Deuteronomy 32:8-9, verse 7 says, ask your fathers and they will tell you, ask your elders and they will say, and then it says lemor, and which to me suggests it's kind of like quote. And so verses 8 and 9 would seem to be reported speech coming from an earlier generation. And so I think I think we have stratigraphy even within Judges 5 and within Exodus 15 and Deuteronomy 32 and maybe Psalm 68 and elsewhere. So yeah, I think
even sections in Torah where it's quoting from Sefer Milchamot Yahweh, like it's quoting from these books that seem to have been archaic, where they switch into a poetic form, and the poetic form seems to encode some geographic information that seems quite obscure even to the writer of the time. And so yeah, it's interesting you have these kind of interpolations where there was preserving previous layers of that. And which is interesting is that, again, the theological difference between those two layers, often we've come into reading the text in a way that erases them. We've been all inherited hermeneutics that erase them. And I think that part of what was striking to people in that episode that I made was I highlighted that like, let's let these be real different for a minute, because they actually are real different. And in that sort of sort of zooming one out and zooming one back, what might we learn? And again, it's speculative to some significant degree. But
I think there's that's something that I always suggest people do. If you want to let these texts operate on their own terms, I think you do have to isolate them from what has come after, what is accreted to them. But you have to be willing to accept the results of that. And I think there are an awful lot of people who are just not willing to accept the results of that. And there's fascinating work by Nassim Amsalag. I don't know if you're familiar with his theory. So the argument there has been made in several papers, and a book that was just published within the last 2 years. Where did it go? Oh, shoot. Oh, there it is. Adonai and the Origins of Ancient Israel, Insights from the Archaeological Record. So based on the imagery that we see in isolating some of these early literary layers, Amsalag argues that before Adonai was transported to the northern hill country, Adonai came from the south and was a deity of metallurgy associated with volcanoes and serpents. Based on, I think the idea that this imagery, the seraphim and so forth, and is associated with Adonai, but is not easily doesn't gain much purchase in the Israelite context. And so Amsalag argues that these must be memories from the pre-Israelite worship of Adonai. I don't know that it's so this was last year. I don't know that it's gained an awful lot of supporters. But
Yeah, I've heard the theory now that you mentioned it, and I my memory was that it basically had not gotten much support. That the storm god, warrior god, entering into the northern hill country at Shiloh, and then sort of splitting into northern and southern variants was sort of the dominant narrative that was, you know, again had the most consensus of scholars at the time. But and that's another question I was thinking about too is what's also revelatory of reading these texts is it's also very clear that the northerners and the southerners develop different theologies.
Mhm.
They're much more comfortable. They have varying levels of comfort when it comes to how much they're willing to engage in what we would call polytheism. And again,
Uh-huh.
not how much they're willing to engage, because they're all willing to engage in this. And I think this is a thing that I don't know, it irks people. I don't know, but that Yahweh probably had a consort through this period. That consort was probably represented in the Jerusalem shrine,
Mhm.
and the shrines all had, there were probably shrines to, there were certainly other gods there as well. And I wonder if you get any sense of how the northerners and the southerners perhaps were differing in the way that they developed their variant of this. Again, religion's a strong word, but for lack of a better word.
I It's such a fascinating question. I think it's to use probably a terrible golf analogy. It's a double breaker. I think we have a few different factors in play. One is that the Northern Kingdom gets cut off around 722 BCE. And so it's not developing anymore. It's frozen in time to some degree, at least the archaeological data.
Right.
But the traditions get picked up and then get carried on by the Southern Kingdom. And I think particularly with Josiah, I see him kind of manipulating things. The Northern Kingdom is not really a threat anymore. It's not in play anymore, and so the traditions are going to be appropriated, and the Northern Kingdom is being vilified
Hmm.
for things that influenced how worship went on in the Jerusalem temple. In my opinion, when we have Sennacherib come through and destroy the main cult sites in the Northern Kingdom in Judea without taking Jerusalem, we get kind of a de facto cult centralization where
Right.
suddenly, if you want to worship Adonai, you've got to come to the temple in Jerusalem. You've got to patronize the priesthood at the temple in Jerusalem. And we have a couple of kings before Josiah who seemed to me to probably be trying to restore the worship that was going on
Hmm.
earlier, which probably included Asherah, and and others. Susan Ackerman makes this argument, probably included ancestral worship as well.
Hmm.
And then we get to Josiah, who in my imagination looked around and said, I kind of like everybody having to come here into Jerusalem. So guess what I just found?
Right. Yeah.
It
The scroll on
turns
the wall.
out,
Yeah.
right, we were supposed to be worshiping only in this location the entire time. Who knew?
And
And
also, he
so,
gets it vetted by a northern prophetess, right? Huldah is
yeah,
from the
hold on.
north, and the
Hmm.
fact that we're getting that, the fact that he's vouchsafing that political theological move by basically getting a northern prophetess to sign off on it. She might have
Hmm.
been the last one, but he's like, look, she says it's cool.
Yeah.
She's
This.
y'all like. Um, but yeah, I see that Hezekiah and Josiah both, that they kind of see the writing on the wall, so to speak, and that the gearing up for what is impending war is also gearing up theologically, because it's, this to their imagination, these are not just armies fighting, these are deities fighting, and
Mhm.
you get your ducks in a row, so to speak. And I think Hezekiah and Josiah both, Josiah mucks it up a bit more than Hezekiah did, marching out and probably getting himself killed by Necho, assuming whatever happened to him.
Yeah.
He may have drank the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and thought that Yahweh was going to save him. Um, but yeah, I love that moment in Josiah where it's just pretty nakedly propaganda.
Mhm.
Oh, we found a scroll on the wall, and it just so happens to be exactly the political program I need to consolidate theological power. And that's why people, when I teach this stuff, I'm like, sometimes they talk about Josiah's reform, but that's taking a side. I think a lot of people, and especially you can see that after Josiah died, they go right back to, you know, polytheism or whatever. But you know, or after Hezekiah dies, um, but that for the other side of this, it was probably Josiah's Inquisition that
Oh
this
yeah.
was not, you know, and there's good reason to believe it wasn't popular. That Menashe, when he restores things, that that was popular, and actually Judea flourishes
Hmm.
economically and along every other metric that we could measure a flourishing tiny little polity.
That's
And
very
it's, you know, of
possible.
course he gets lambasted in the literature because of, goes back to all the bad stuff.
And I think that that plays into the way the Judean scribal community is representing the history of the North as well, because the up until the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, the North was the real powerhouse. This
Right, the
was,
Amrides.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was the largest extent of the Israelite kingdom, and
Right.
it gets appropriated by the Davidic tradition, and Omri gets, you know, a couple of verses,
Mhm.
and is dismissed as a wicked king. But I imagine that Judea is playing the role of the little brother here for a while, and then suddenly they take center stage when the North is no longer there, and I imagine Josiah wants to uh, ensure that you know, they don't they don't make poor use of this opportunity, and you know, they appropriate this identity of Israel. You know, it was a united kingdom all along, is the charter myth that develops, or it
Right.
was supposed to be united all along. And I think there's probably a degree to which the South was trying to differentiate itself from the
Mhm.
North, in terms of the worship that was going on, and that is probably somewhat responsible for the differences, and then for the ease with which Josiah leans into vilifying everything that was that had been going on, and that the two kings between Hezekiah and Josiah were engaged in. And so I think a lot of this is propaganda responding to socio-political circumstances and trying to use the deity as an identity marker, and Josiah is kind of circling the wagons around this deity, and what begins as a local, not incredibly dominant or strong deity kind of stumbles into becoming
Right.
what we know today, because of all of these circumstances dovetailing with, I think, you know, later on we get more philosophical ideas about deity as the superlative and all this kind of stuff, and Adonai is the one that is there who gets to take on all these qualities. But I think because you've got a very small community that's not nearly as stratified as some of the empires around them, as Egypt, and Anatolia, and in Mesopotamia, you can kind of reduce it to a single deity. There aren't a ton of different national
Right.
deities vying for that central role, and Josiah is able to get rid of Baal and Asherah. I've pointed out a lot that we can't confidently date any negative references to Asherah prior to the reign of Josiah.
Right.
That pretty much all of them probably are either reworkings of earlier material, or stories that were developed under and after the reign of Josiah in the Deuteronomistic literature. And I think that that one deity is there when suddenly there's the Babylonian exile, and
Right.
that becomes, and you've got there's a need to kind of again circle the wagons. If this community, if this identity is to survive, the Northern Kingdom didn't survive when it gets scattered around the Neo-Assyrian Empire. For as far as I'm aware, it just vanishes.
Right.
Everything is left to the Judahites, or the Judeans, however you want to refer to them. But they are successful during their exile, maintaining that cohesiveness, that identity, and I think it's
Mhm.
because they are.
You know what's crazy actually? Is the same thing would literally happen again. But unfortunately, um I want to say again, I mean like the Romans. The Romans literally did this. They exiled them. But that's I wonder why. Why was it that the I don't want to say the name, but why was it that the ancient, the ancient people, the ancient Hebrew people, yeah, I could say that. Why was it that the ancient Hebrew people able to survive the like first exile, but they weren't able to survive the Roman exile? Because again, you need to remember that's the reason why the Hebrew language went extinct, and technically, technically, like just Hebrews in general, kind of just like technically vanished. Like they technically did vanish after the Roman exile. So that is kind of mind-boggling to me how, like, because the Roman Empire, albeit like, yeah, they typically tend to they were pretty bad when it comes to minorities, right? But like the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, I mean, especially what Babylon did to freaking Jerusalem, that was no joke either. So it is kind of interesting to see that they were able to survive that, but they weren't able to survive the Roman expulsion. That's interesting.
Able to rally around a single deity.
Right. And this is a thing that I've also pointed out, I think, too, is that the region's kind of deity poor. The Canaan is kind of deity poor compared to Mesopotamia. The Hittites, of course, they're not there anymore by this time period, and the Egyptians, of course, obviously aren't deity poor. Canaan is kind of deity poor, and you kind of get what I would consider a monotheism by subtraction, which is very different than a monotheism by philosophical assertion, where you prove the existence of a god and that god does a bunch of stuff. I think that
was what I was thinking when I did that previous reaction. Remember, in that previous reaction, those two reaction of Yahweh, I was thinking like that was the word I was looking for. Monotheism by philosophical means. That was the word I was looking for. Yeah, I thought that was what I was gonna see in that reaction. That he would transform via that meme, not transforming because, well, just he just so happened to be there.
What I've characterized it as is that what we have is just Yahweh's the last God standing.
Yeah,
and that the
literally
Judahites, for reasons, and we'll get maybe into this in more in just a moment, for whatever reason, the prophets like Ezekiel, the prophet priests like Ezekiel,
like, bro, like, well, the way how I'm getting this and the way how he's basically saying, he's just saying like, yeah, Yahweh just so happened to be the only God around. That was just, I was like, whoa. I was like, oh, that I was not expecting
other folks
that.
in exile really doubled down on this deity in a way that was theologically, I think, quite revolutionary. That
it is revolutionary.
That probably didn't even make a lot of sense at the time, but had this very transformative quality. And I guess this is another question that I'll pose to you, because you've done work on theorizing monotheism in a sort of an interesting way.
I'm away.
Is this a helpful category at all? Thinking about Hebrew Bible, and I wonder, just to introduce to folks, right? There's monotheistic rhetoric, and there's actually monotheistic metaphysical claims.
Yeah,
monotheistic rhetoric is, my God is the only God. Your gods are nothing. But it's a rhetorical move that we see in Egyptian literature and Mesopotamian literature, where we know that whatever the hymn to Amun, I think it is, they'd never abandoned the idea that there was Thoth and other gods there. It's just that in this moment, the rhetoric is really like hyping up this one God in a kind of exaggerated way. And I do think we see that kind of rhetoric, certainly in the Deuteronomist and other places. But the classic argument made by Smith and others, right, is that there is a sea change that is there to be found in Deutero-Isaiah.
Yeah, okay, before he continues here, because he's going to talk about something good. What he said previously, how when the ancient Israelites went into exile after Babylon went and completely destroyed their capital, Jerusalem, and everything in it, which is probably what happened to the Ark of the Covenant as well. Again, goes right back into that video that I was reacting to the other day. remember what I said? Everything is God's will, right? Everything is God's will. And I even said this too in the other video. You got to keep that in mind. You got to keep that in mind. It's funny because when said argument that I described happened earlier, my mother said, oh, well, everything is God's will, and really and truly, he allows people to discover certain things. And I was like, okay, well, why did he allow these scholars? I'm not talking about him. I'm just saying, like, the people like who discover all this stuff in general. I'm like, okay, then why did he allow these people to discover these details about, well, him, about Yahweh, aka him, right? Like I said in my video, most likely God wanted the ancient Israelites to double down. So he made all the other gods. He literally got rid of all the other gods using the Neo-Babylonian Empire. God does that. That's literally how God works. So it's like, it makes sense. It makes sense. I don't care if you're Islam. I don't care if you're freaking Jewish. I don't care who you are. I'm just talking about God's personality right now, which our personality comes from. Because remember, we're made in the image of God. Okay? So you can't say that, oh, I'm wrong. Like, no, that makes perfect sense. Like, okay, he wants these people to acknowledge him as the supreme God, which he is. I'm not saying that he's not. So what is a good way to do that? Get rid of everything else via, I don't know. Well, what happened canonically, that's how he got rid of that. Like, that's literally what God does. I mean, he did the same thing with Noah and the ark, right? When he wanted to just have a change, when he wants a major drastic revolutionary change to happen, God just does that. Quite literally, he does things like that. Okay, you can even say the dinosaurs too. It's like, oh, God wanted a change, a major drastic revolutionary change. There's a pattern, guys. I just think about that for a second. Anytime there's a major drastic revolutionary change, it is usually behind some like destructive event. And we have the Bible talks about this. I mean, it is very clear. This is how God works. That's how he works. So it's like, okay, like I just simply believe that, okay, God is Yahweh, and God, with all these other gods that were around, God was like, I need to show these people, I need to assert my dominance, and I need to assert that I am the God above everything else. That's how I view it. Okay, and if he had the ability to do that, to go and make the freaking Neo-Babylonian Empire go and completely destroy Jerusalem, go and completely destroy the Ark of the Covenant, which most likely was destroyed when Jerusalem was basically eradicated for a time period. It's like, shit. Who's to say that he isn't the God above gods? You know what I mean?
And I have to admit that I'm convinced that something has changed there.
Mm-hmm.
That the rhetoric has begun to drink its metaphysical Kool-Aid, that they have actually gone over to a kind of monotheism by subtraction in a kind of way, or a monotheism by deletion. But I think that your take, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's much better to take this as a much later monotheism associated with creatio ex nihil, that real monotheism doesn't actually develop until I don't know, maybe John Philopoulos and people in those early periods where God is the only thing that exists and creates everything out of nothing. And I'd like to hear more of your analysis of Deutero-Isaiah and things like this. And I guess the last thing I'll say is another place where I see monotheism is in the apocalyptic. The apocalyptic seems to be quite monotheistic, especially in the determinism that seems to be triumphant in books like Enoch, and God seems to be pulling all the strings, and we're all kind of puppets. And that's kind of what's great about the apocalyptic, is that things are real bad, but God's driving the show, and it's all gonna work out. And that to me relies on a kind of, there is only one God running things, and et cetera, et cetera. Not that there aren't subordinate beings, but yeah, that's a lot to throw at you. But I'm kind of curious, like, where you, because your scholarship is really wonderful and really thoughtful in this regard, and I'd love to sort of hear it from the horse's mouth, and also let the amazing 728 people watching this also get some sense of where you land
728.
on those
God
questions. I
damn.
think you have a fascinating analysis.
Well, I appreciate the way you frame it as a difference between rhetoric and then kind of a metaphysical assertion about reality. I think that's really what it comes down to. I have a trade book coming out next year where I have a chapter on whether or not the Bible says there's only one God, and I introduce it by, my little anecdote for the beginning of the chapter is all about the first time I saw my dad cry, which was in 1998 when the Broncos won the Super Bowl. And that was a time period when I, a lot easier than I can today, would say things like would not be out of character for me to say things like, there's no other football team but the Broncos. Who can compare to the Broncos? There's the Broncos and there's nobody else. The Raiders aren't even a real football team. Like, this is just rhetoric. This is how I make other people who share in that social identity feel good. And I kind of poke at people who don't share in that social identity. And I think that's what we've got going on with the rhetoric of incomparability, which you mentioned we see in the great Cairo hymn of Amun-Ra, and which we see in hymns about
Let me pause real quick. So what's the deal with all these other gods? That is something that you need to address, right? Like, that is true. Like, it does state that, yeah, the word of God, the Bible does state that, yeah, God is like the only God, no other God aside from him. Now, again, I think this is like just interpretation means. I remember, you gotta remember the time period that the Bible was written in. These people couldn't read, these people couldn't write, and time was a lot different. So the way to describe things, was just a lot more simplified, right? Okay, like, and remember how I talk about how people like to ask questions about, oh, well, if God is real, why doesn't he go and tell us how the freaking universe is made? Why does he go into detail about that? It's like, why do you need to know that? It's literally like, why do you need to know that? Like, you don't need to know that. How does this information affect you? Like, how does it benefit you? You know what I mean? So it's just useless info. Because remember, why are we on Earth? We're literally here as basically just one giant social test to see how we're gonna treat people. That's it. To see how we're gonna treat people and if we're gonna serve God. That's literally it. You feel those two things, you're gonna go to hell, right? You prove to be a shitty person who can't even treat people right and doesn't even serve God. You're gonna go to hell, right? Because it's funny, because I've seen these people who are quote unquote serving God, and they go and do the most ungodly shit known to mankind. Right? They go and lie. They go and sabotage other people, which is deception, by the way. Deceiving is a big sin. Okay? The devil himself, that's like one of the main things that the devil does. So deceiving, which is a big thing that I see a lot of these so-called followers of God do. Okay? That's a big one. So it's like, cool, great, you're serving God, but you're still a shitty person. So you're still gonna go to hell. You know what I mean? So, and it's even worse if you are actively serving God and you are aware of God, because God is gonna just look at you and just be like, okay, so you were aware of my teachings and you were still doing shitty person thing. Okay, straight to hell. You know what I mean? So it's like, why the hell would we need to know about these other deities? Simple. Why would we need to know? What purpose would they do for us? Nothing. Nothing. Because again, why are we on Earth? A social experiment. One big social experiment to see how we're going to treat other people and if we're going to serve God. That's it. Why the hell would we need to learn about these other deities for? No reason. So I'm pretty sure that's why God just, I mean, even though he does kind of like, they're bringing up, like he does mention, like give details of like these other, like the council that he was talking about. But clearly we could see that he only like brings his stuff up when it's kind of like relevant and he really has to like mention it. You know what I mean? But overall, it's like there's no need to. So why would he need to do that? Why would he need to constantly tell us about these other deities for these other entities? Like it doesn't affect us. You know what I mean? Like the last time he talked about another entity was Jesus, right? He sent Jesus on earth, and he was like, "Okay, guys, this right here, you gotta pay attention to him because this guy is gonna die for your sins." Like, bam.
Shamash in Mesopotamia.
So
and
that's how I
elsewhere,
interpret that.
which it's not only kind of neglecting and demeaning all the other gods from other nations, but it's kind of, you take turns hyping up your own deities and even subordinate all your other own deities to that one deity by saying, oh, they're the best, nobody can compare to them, they created all the other deities bow down to them. And that's kind of what you have throughout the majority of the Bible, with this idea that, you know, he's Adonai is God of gods, and who can compare? You mentioned that rhetoric earlier. That's pretty consistent. Now, when we get to Deutero-Isaiah, we find this rhetoric, this I am and there is no other rhetoric. And what some scholars have pointed out, there have been a handful of them that have pushed back against the consensus view that Deutero-Isaiah is the threshold of monotheism. Saul Oleon published a wonderful paper a little over 10 years ago in I think the Journal of Ancient Near Eastern Religions, or was it Vedas Testamentum? It was one of the two, but it's entitled, "Is Isaiah 40 through 55 really monotheistic?" And one of the things he pointed out was a lot of the rhetoric that you find in Deuteronomy, or Deuteronomy, is the same as what we find in Deutero-Isaiah. The big difference is that Deuteronomy 2 verses later will say, "Now all gods bow down to him."
Right.
So like it's juxtaposing this rhetoric with pretty explicit references to other gods, whereas in Deutero-Isaiah we don't have those explicit references to other gods. So is something different here? And Saul points.
And Smith thinks those are interpolations. I think is what his argument is, that those interpolations are interpolations into D.
Oh,
That
really?
they're not original to D. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that he thinks that those are, and it's a bit odd. And when you get into the book itself, because I was looking at it carefully, and I'm like, that doesn't seem like an interpolation.
Yeah.
But he seems to think that the rhetorical monotheistic moments at Deuteronomy 6:4 and stuff like that, that those are interpolations into D that are post-exilic. I don't know if I buy it, but that's how he explains why those are there.
Because I mean, certainly you have different layers to D. Like it is a developing tradition. I think Romer would identify three main kind of layers to it. But but what Saul points to is the fact that you still have in Deutero-Isaiah, you have reference to like Rahab and these battles, these primordial battles between Adonai and these mythological creatures. You have God summoning the host of heaven, which is, from other literature, this is the gods of the divine council, or the gods that comprise God's military retinue. He calls forth the stars and names every one, and none are missing. Kind of rhetoric is, and you also have a bunch of plural imperatives. Usually it's hear and witness and stuff like this, which is something that is what you do for the divine council. A friend of mine named David Bakavoy published a paper in Vedas Testamentum about Amos having these plural imperatives to hear and to bear witness as kind of tacit divine council motifs. And so while they're not explicitly referring to other gods, the whole rest of the framework seems to be there to one degree or another. And I think it's probably playing into some of their anti-idol rhetoric in
Right.
Deutero-Isaiah. We're in Babylon, but we don't want to be of Babylon. This is where that insularity comes into play. If we're going to remain Judahites, Judeans, whatever we're going to call ourselves, then we need to ensure that we are devoted entirely to Adonai, and we're going to shove away all the gods that are around us. We're not going to worship those gods the way that they worship them around here, to the degree that we're not even going to call them gods. We're gonna refer to them as I forget all of the terms that they
Some of them are quite colorful. Like it's the same wood that turns into the idol of Bel is then that same wood is burned and somewhere else. And
Nebo is like teetering and things like this.
Right.
And
the great rhetorical flourish is the animals have to carry your gods, but our God carries us. It's like that. Again, quite beautiful poetry. But I agree, it's difficult to tease out in where rhetoric might be metaphysics. In those sections.
And I think it's difficult for some people to recognize rhetoric as rhetoric when the rhetoric is so interconnected with the dogmas that they expect to be in the text. And then there's also the fact that I think you see some of this rhetoric is used in references to other nations. You've got some references to the folks who build idols. They are nothing and less than nothing, which is similar. It's not identical, but it's similar to the dismissal of the gods of the other nations. You have Babylon and Nineveh or Moab are represented. They're personified as women. And they say in their hearts, I am, and there is no other, which is adopting that monotheistic rhetoric for these personified cities, but not in a way that makes any sense if the point is no other cities exist. I'm the only city that exists. In my opinion, the point of that rhetoric, whether it's in the mouth of the personified Babylon or it's in the mouth of the God of Israel, the point is I'm the only one that matters. Right. That none of the others are relevant to our people, and I'm the only one that matters. And
bam, bam, bam. Literally what I just said, but slightly different. No, not even slightly different. He's just talking about cities. Literally what I said. Like, I literally just said this regarding like the whole idea of the like other gods. Like, they're irrelevant as shit. I'm the only one that matters, bruh. Yo, I swear. Yo, look, I don't want to like gas myself up, bro, but like long time ago, my teacher, I was a kid, 7, 8 years old, no, 7, 6, I don't know, 7, 6, 8, some shit like that, right? I remember my teacher, she looked at the whole class because I answered the question that nobody couldn't. And she said, I am a very smart kid. Because traditionally, everyone just viewed me as dumb. I did always call myself dumb. But she said that I am a very smart kid. But the only problem with me is that I just need to stop playing games and just read. Just read some more. I'm like, I always like wondered, like, sometimes I think about that. I'm like, damn, was she really right? Because I always thought I was a stupid ass person. I was like, And then as I got older, my brains, I don't know. I thought I was like a freaking sped kid. Demonetized, I guess. Special ed kid. And I probably am neurodivergent. I've had plenty of people who are like autistic, who are around like autistic people, autistic kids, blah 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 blah. And they're like experts in that, and they're like, and they look at me and they're like, yeah, you show signs of it. Like you definitely 99% certain that you are on the spectrum. That's for sure, right? So, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is it's all relevant because I was just very slow as a kid. But I don't know, around like the first time I visited America, I don't know, it's like a fucking switch. Just literally, I'm not even kidding. I just started to interpret things like a lot more different, to the point where I noticed that average people couldn't even like interpret it. You know what I mean? I was like, what the hell? But I don't know. But I'm just saying, if I could interpret this the way how a freaking expert scholar over here, without even barely just reading it, and just through raw assumption and just literally just raw thought, then I don't know. I usually don't like gas myself up, but that's
And even if
I
you
think that's
say
deserved.
this is the threshold of monotheism, it seems to.
But that's mad. That's so mad
take 2
that
steps back
that we arrived to like the same conclusion pretty much.
for a while, because once we get into post-exilic literature, when we get into things like Daniel, when we get into the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we get into other literature, the gods come roaring back. And I think they are recast as lower level deities, the bottom tier of the pantheon. They're they're angels now, but they're the words for deity, El, Elim, Elohim. They're still being used in reference to these entities.
Right.
And so I think
That's literally what I said. That's literally what I said in my previous video. I was like, guys, the English word for God, you literally have to look at the English word for God. It could mean so many things, bro. Literally, I explained this all in my last part, which I hope that you watched. And if you did, you know that I explained that. I don't feel like repeating myself, but bruh, that's crazy. That's crazy, bruh. This is literally everything that I was literally saying in the last part. Me and this guy are agreeing. That's mad. That's mad. This is why I said it in the last part. I was like, I just grew up hearing the Bible, but I feel like I need to reread it for myself. I have my own interpretation. Even my mom has told me that. She was like, because my mom noticed, she was like, you have a different way of viewing things, and it usually tends to be like extremely like more accurate than the average folk. So she was like, you need to just reread the Bible. And she looked at me and she was like, maybe that's why God sent you here, because she was like, God sent everyone on earth for a reason. And she said, I don't know, maybe that's why God sent you here. Maybe that's your purpose. She said, maybe your purpose is to go and educate people on it properly, because a lot of people interpret the Bible in such bad ways. Because she was hearing me, like talk about certain things that I believe people like got wrong about the Bible, and she was like, oh shit, that actually makes a lot of sense. You know what I mean? Stuff that I talk about in my videos all the time that you hear me talk about. So anything that I tell her, I'd say here on camera.
I think it's
And
just
even
a
of
little.
the dead, which is interesting.
Oh yeah,
Even of
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that the writers of these texts will equivocate on these words in a way that we find, like St. Thomas Aquinas would find that theologically maddening, in a way that the Israelites did not give a damn.
Yeah.
Like they're like, no, that's what these things are. They're Elim. They're they're like the when the Baal Adov at Endor sees the ghost of whatever it is of Samuel.
Yeah.
She sees an Elohim coming up at her. And the writer of that didn't blink an eye. They could have used any number of ruach or something. They could have used any other, but that's the term they chose for this sort of dead prophet. And I think that those kind of equivocations are equivocations that we find theologically very alarming, but the
Yeah.
Israelites did not at all. It did not bother them in the least.
I think we want our categories to bear a lot more weight
Mhm.
than they actually bore anciently. And I talk a little bit in my book about how archaeologically there's so much overlap between the deceased and deities, and Elohim is a word that is used in a couple of different places to refer to the deceased, and I even joke about how you have I pointed to a bunch of different publications where an artifact was discovered, and half the publications say this is an offering table for a mortuary chapel, and the other half of the publications say this is an altar of sacrifice for a deity. And it's like, well, tomato, tomato.
Right.
They can kind of be. There's, I think that's a distinction without a difference in a lot of ways.
Right. And the whole
Um,
complicated business of the Rephaim and how they transform as deified dead in the Ugaritic literature to sort of giants for the Israelites to defeat, or Abraham to defeat, or whatever, in battle.
yeah.
And again, the Israelites negotiating, some of the Israelites negotiating what to do with these Rephaim, which is also again the intersection of like post-mortem divine beings and
Hmm.
other kinds of entities the Israelites are mucking about with, which is a whole nother topic
Yeah.
that's incredibly complicated. Um, Maybe also could say a little bit about, I think we'd have to all admit, I think at some of that Deutero-Isaiah is ambiguous. Um, it's ambiguous. No one's gonna.
Yeah.
It's not a smoking gun for monotheism.
Agree.
Um, where do you, for you, where do you see that smoking gun for the first time? And from some of the work I've read of yours, it's much later, in a really interesting way. Maybe say a little bit more about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. I just realized we hadn't gotten to that, and I was excited to talk about that because I when I was at Trinity Western University, one of the things that I saw as having a lot of explanatory power for answering this research question that I was not satisfied with, what is a deity? I happened to be looking into cognitive linguistics at the time, and which just fascinates me and overturned a lot of assumptions that I had. But one of the things that cognitive linguistics tries to do is deploy all the tools that are available from the cognitive sciences and related sciences to try to understand how language works and how people use language. And one of the kind of light bulb above the head moments for me was when I started looking into prototype theory, which is a theoretical framework for how we naturally form conceptual categories. And these are categories that don't exist as sui generis delineable categories in nature, but are categories that we create and we put boundaries on, usually secondarily, usually for rhetorical purposes. But I was interested in this because it was going to help me better understand what the words for God meant in the Hebrew Bible. But I also became interested in it for what it tells us about what monotheism means. And I think the first key is to understanding what precisely monotheism means. And Nathan MacDonald wrote a wonderful book called Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism that talks about the development of the concept of monotheism through the word monotheism, which originates around 1660 with the Cambridge
Right.
Platonists
Thomas
and kind
More,
of
right?
Thomas More, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then Ralph Cudworth and some
Right.
others. And then we get into the 18th century and we have some deists who are taking up use of this word. And if you go look in the earliest dictionaries, the first time you see monotheism popping up in the dictionaries, it's in the mid 1700s. And it's defined as the doctrine of the Unitarians, which is idiosyncratic to say the least. But
Sure.
you don't get this idea that it has to do with the number of gods until Webster. Webster's 1828 American English Dictionary. It says I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's something along the lines of the doctrine or belief that only one God exists. which is not how the word was ever used up to that point.
Right.
I
And I
think
think also Webster uses it to tie ethics in too, which I always thought was a weird. It's a weird. We in philosophy we call that a smuggled position. That
yeah.
there being one God doesn't have any indicator that God is responsible for what's good and bad. That there's no logical connection between ethics and in existence. And
Well,
I've always
and
found that to be a weird thing that gets smuggled in with monotheism. That there's one God and that God's responsible for ethics. I'm
well,
like
I
what does one have to do with the other?
and I think that probably has to do with the way the word was being used, because a lot of what the category was supposed to encapsulate was not, it was not a an inductive analysis of all of the different theological frameworks that was trying to make observations about where natural lines existed.
Right.
It was an us versus them. We're the
Mhm.
good guys, they're the bad guys, and we are described as monotheists. And you would think, oh, okay, monotheist means one God. That's kind of, you kind of get the idea from Moore and Cudworth and others that it means worship of only one God. But then they're like, oh, look, the Muslims, they
Yeah.
have a hypocritical pretense to monotheism. They're not real monotheists, but they're more monotheists than Christians are in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then they're
Yeah.
getting on the case
Even I knew that, bruh.
of materialists, and they talk about how the
Even I knew
materialists
that.
make the world one God and the only Jehovah that exists. But because it's not a personal sentient deity, he says doesn't count. They're just atheists. And
Right.
so as you go through how they're talking about monotheism, it is not whoever only believes in or worships one God. It's really, you have to believe in the right kind of God, and it has to be the main God, and it doesn't have to be the only one. It just has to be the one who's in charge. And so there is an ethical dimension to a lot of what is being said. But
Yeah. It's literally like what I was saying. Yeah. I think more people need to hear that. Literally. More people need to hear this because people have this like super skewed like view on how like based on how they are raised, and it's just wrong.
I think
So
Webster is appealing to an etymological fallacy, trying to reduce this down to this concept, because there was a gentleman who was the head of a they didn't call him atheists. I don't think they called him free thinkers. I forget what they called him, but there was a gentleman who was the head of one of these societies in the 19th century, and his definition was like a paragraph long, but probably the most accurate definition that you have in any dictionary. But when you look at the way people use it today, it's still an identity marker and a value judgment.
Mhm.
It's about us versus them, whether it's saying, oh, Catholics aren't monotheists, or Mormons aren't really monotheists, or, Islam isn't truly monotheistic. It's used as an identity marker and a value judgment. But I come down to three different understandings of what monotheism is to actually try to answer the question. One of them is this Enlightenment concept of monotheism that was developed by Moore and Cudworth and the deists and others, which is this conceptual package that is about the right kind of deity who creates everything ex nihilo. And I think that, and this is important because the doctrine of creation ex nihilo comes out of these debates about the morality of eternal matter, because Greek philosophers understood matter to exist in a changeable state for all eternity. But if that's the case, then God is not, there was something that existed apart from God.
Right.
And there were debates about
It's like John
what,
Philoponus is really that's his whole bag. It's like
yeah,
the eternality of the world is a big, big no, and that has
yeah.
to be defeated at all costs. Otherwise, you compromise God's sovereignty.
freaking out, bro. I need to stretch. Sitting down here for like, oh my god. Ugh.
Yeah.
And yeah, John Philoponus
Oh.
basically single-handedly forged that entire that whole theological worldview in many ways.
And that undergirds the Cambridge Platonists. That undergirds a lot of how people think about creation ex nihilo and God's sovereignty today. Even when you look in scholarship that is ostensibly critical, there's a lot of presupposition that you need creation ex nihilo, and a lot of apologists, Copan and Craig. I think that's who the two authors. I know Paul Copan is one of them. I think William Lane Craig is the other. Wrote a book on creation ex nihilo.
Oh, yeah, that's why he's so big about the Kalam argument. He needs that because otherwise you sort of betray God's philosophical sovereignty because there's some pre-existing thing, which is what the text precisely says happened.
Yeah,
that there was waters and there was monsters in it, and that Yahweh beat those monsters up. I mean, we have an entire creation story in Psalm 74 that it's very archaic, that there's some memory of at the very beginning of Genesis of the Tanaim in there, but clearly there was a pre-existent battle with sort of Leviathan, like, you know, the Leviathan fight.
Yeah,
that we
that's
see back in
interesting.
Ugaritic stuff with Baal or whatever. So yeah, it's just again, it's an interesting philosophical presupposition or theological presupposition that you just have to railroad in. And they've always, I remember like when they did the dog and pony shows when I was an undergrad, where they would bring William Lane Craig in and the atheist guy in, and they would do this thing where they would do their thing. And I was like, what an interesting bedfellow that this evangelical Christian guy will like reach across the table for anything that will get rid of the sea monsters in the water, primordial waters, that he would reach across the table to a Muslim.
Yeah.
In a way that in no other world is that even imaginable. But that shows you how desperate they are to get rid of the primordial waters and the Leviathan that lurks in it.
Yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and in so much apologetics.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful book that was published 2020 by Noga Ayali Darshan called The Storm God and the Sea, which talks about the representation of that battle and whether it was associated with salvation or with, establishing a deity's sovereignty or with creation. I think that's a really good discussion there. But when we talk about monotheism, the word, the term, the conceptual package has never existed independent of creation ex nihilo and these philosophical frameworks. And so when we look back at the Bible and try to find monotheism in the Bible, what we want to be there is not going to be there.
Right.
And so we've got the Enlightenment concept, and then we've got what I call the etymological fallacy, the dictionary definition that we first see with Webster, and that usually, if you look in a dictionary today, you're going to find something pretty reductive, pretty simplistic about belief in that only one God exists or something like that. And then I have what I call the renegotiated concept, which is how we understand monotheism so that we can find it in the Bible. And this is largely, I think, the work of confessional scholars, whether Jewish or Christian, who are trying to maintain this contiguity, this continuity with the ideologies of the Bible. Because if we are Bible believers, if we are subordinating ourselves to the principles in the Bible, and we are monotheists, then obviously the Bible has to be monotheistic as well. And I think you see a lot of different ways that scholars try to read monotheism into the text, and some are doing it rather furtively, trying to insist that it's there and there's never a question about it, whether it's because it's in Deutero-Isaiah or elsewhere. But I think you have other scholars, and Benjamin Sommer, I think, is one of them, who kind of openly are saying, hey, we've got to redefine what monotheism is to find it in the Bible, but we need to find it in the Bible.
Right.
And so here's this idea, and I even quote Summers in a paper I presented at Brown University back in May, where he, let me see if I can find the actual, he says, the common definition of monotheism would require us to classify not only the Hebrew Bible, but most forms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as polytheism. I don't agree with that. I think
that seems a stretch. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you don't necessarily have one unless you have the other. So we don't have to say polytheism if there's no monotheism. Such a definition fails to capture,
I see what he's saying,
something essential.
I see what he's saying.
That distinguishes these religions from classical Greek religion, Hinduism, and Shintoism. And so he goes on to define it as the belief that one supreme being exists, whose
That's an interesting way of interpreting things. I mean, it's like, yeah, you do need one. Like monotheism is one, but when you have polytheism, because guys, just look at the root word. Mono means one, and poly just means many. So when you're like saying like, I'm in a poly relationship right now, that means that you're openly dating like more than one people, like polygamy or whatever the hell they call it. Or when people say monogamy, like, oh, I'm in a monogamous relationship, which is the most popular type of relationship right now, and the type of relationship that the Bible openly promotes. Well, no, the Bible actually promotes, in Islam, I know this for sure. If I'm not mistaken, the Bible does promote polygamy among Muslim men. I do know that. The Christian Bible, I want to say like Muslim, like Bible. I'm talking the Quran, okay? Um, the Christian Bible, not really. It's more just, yeah, like polygamy. I mean monogamy. So if you don't know that, yeah.
will is sovereign over all other beings. And it seems to me that this is essentializing the Abrahamic religions. There's something there, and so we just need to find whatever that something
Right.
is and slap the label monotheism on it, because that then achieves the goal of reuniting, and it feels so good, the Bible with our devotional confessional communities today. And because I think that's the goal of so much of this arguing about what monotheism is, I think that is a motivated definition. That conclusion is a motivated one. And then I talk about how Richard Bauckham does it as well when it comes to early Christology and early
Right.
Christianity.
And this is to the point that I think I've made in a couple of talks I've given, is that in some sense it's actually worse than there's no monotheism in the Bible. There might just not be monotheism even after that. That that there's a basic philosophical problem that insofar as you transcendentalize your God, you create a metaphysical problem where you got to get some way that infinite faraway God did this. You gotta fill the gap.
Mhm.
And you can make that move and say God's completely singular, utterly transcendent, and utterly sovereign. And then the next breath, you're gonna have to tell me the story by which you build the ladder to connect here and there. And you will all inevitably end up throwing beings into that gap. And that's what we see in Jewish bitheism, right? The so-called two powers in heaven.
Mhm.
You immediately get the first real speculations on those sort of radical monotheism in the rabbinical circles, and they immediately have to go, well, yeah, the true God is totally, Nistar, totally hidden. But then there's this Yahweh Katan. I'm like, Yahweh Katan. And this is like and it's Metatron and all this stuff. And in the apocalyptic literature, I think Christianity does a similar kind of move with the Christology stuff.
Oh yeah.
Kabbalah, right? I mean, one of my favorite lines in Kabbalah is one of these Kabbalists or anti-Kabbalists said, the Kabbalah is worse than the Trinity. The Kabbalists are making God 10. At least the Christians has made God 3. Like, and so I find that again, the business of the kavod, that God's kavod, God's glory, is a kind of an independent being that receives the prayers of Israel, whereas God's sovereignty is protected somehow. To me, the question of monotheism fails not just when we go looking for the Bible, it actually fails metaphysically, because any sufficiently transcendent being becomes so irrelevant that there's no theophany, which most of these religions need. And in order to get that transcendence to theophany pipeline, they got to pack stuff back in there. And almost always you're going to multiply beings.
Yeah.
That seems to be the ultimate kind of thing that ends up happening, is a multiplication of beings. And that to me seems to be in violation of any kind of robust theory of monotheism.
Yeah, well, I think it's the collision of the traditions that we've inherited with this developing philosophical industry, and we've got to try to wed the two somehow, when it's not
So I interpret it as misunderstanding, and like misinterpretations of what monotheism is truly supposed to
Not a
mean.
happy marriage. There's there's a
Right.
lot of conflict, but I think it's such a fascinating project. I love seeing like Philo talk about how the logos, the
Mhm.
logos is the answer for crossing that unbridgeable
Right. The
gap,
gap. Right.
and
And that does
and
enormous work for Christians, of course. That's
yeah, and that lays the
yeah.
foundation for Johannine Christology,
Yeah.
and then the Logos becomes flesh, and that's Jesus. But I love that Philo describes the Logos as the second God,
Right.
because you've got this passage in Genesis where it says somebody God says, "Come up to God," or something like that, and he's like, "Oh, this God is the Logos, because
Right.
it's operating in history and time and space and everything like that. That's a second God."
Right.
And then
Demiurges, and in the Hermetic tradition, you get this sort of secondary god in the form of the sort of cosmocrator kind of entity. Yeah, I
Mhm,
think it's just born out of a logical. It's born out of a metaphysical logical problem as much as it's born out of a textual one. And I would,
mhm.
I've said, like, look, like, whether or not there is monotheism, whatever that is in Deutero Isaiah, I can guarantee you it didn't stick around, because the moment you got it, the moment you got a transcendent God, you had to fill the gap.
Mhm.
And like the moment you get what you want, the only thing worse than getting what you want is getting it. And now you have to actually betray the very
Yeah,
principle in order to
having to
build up.
live with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's you can't have your
I could shake hands with these people. I could shake hands with these people. This right here, like they're making a whole bunch of sense right now. Cause this is how I view this stuff. This is criminal. This is actually like insane that this only has like 60,000 views when I looked at it. That's mad, bro. My goodness. Yo, so many people need to hear this shit more, bro.
cake and eat it too when it comes to this monotheism business. I think at just a fundamental metaphysical level. And it's amazing. You see, by the time you get to the late Neoplatonists, where they're solving the same kind of problem along pagan lines, whatever pagan is, and it's amazing how many henads and emanations and you know they end up tossing into that gap to fill the gap, because it's an infinite gap, so it
Mhm.
can take an infinite amount of beings to fill it. And again, like these kinds of moves, I often find to be symptomatic of the fact that it might be the case that monotheism doesn't actually logically make any metaphysical sense,
Yeah.
that there
And
might be an inherent problem with it.
one of the things I've pointed out is one of the ways that religious dogmas are constantly evolving is you're always having to chase down and catch the implications of whatever dogma you just came up
Sure.
with.
Whack-a-mole.
Because it's as you say, every time you reach kind of a new philosophical realization or conclusion or something like that, you then have to turn around and be like, crap, we gotta
Yeah.
we gotta somehow make this work with the rest of the system, and it's not a perfect system. And so yeah, it's you see that in the development of the Trinity. You see it in development of concepts of sin,
I'm
original
surprised they haven't
sin, all
talked
this
much
kind
about
of
the
stuff. Like
Trinity. I
when you
was
tell people
I was really expecting to talk more about the Trinity, but
the Immaculate Conception is actually about the conception of Mary,
Yeah.
they're like, why? It's like,
Yeah. Or
well,
just the concept of original sins. Like, yeah,
yeah,
Isaiah. I mean, Ezekiel doesn't believe that.
no.
Like
Oh,
he
none of them do.
reject. Yeah, none of them do. They like me, but he even explicitly says, like, you cannot inherit your father's. That's just not a thing.
Yeah,
In stark contrast to even sort of Deuteronomy, you can inherit at least for some generations.
yeah.
So yeah, these going to trying to get these texts, this sort of quilt, this library of ancient Israelite literature to fit through the whole, our own special theological whole that we have decided is the one whole to rule them all. It just mutilates the text. And
Yeah.
I
oh
find that
shit.
at the
One
end of the day, I don't know how you feel about this, but
that Lord of the
for
Rings
me, as a
reference.
person who is religious, I found that my religious sensibilities are deepened, by wrestling with it, as
Oh yeah.
opposed to saying, "Hey, this all makes a neat, perfect little box, and let me tell you how it is, and da da da. I've always said that that it's the wrestling with this text and this tradition that I identify with religiously much more than believing in it, because I don't even know what it even means to believe in a text
yeah.
that is patently a quilt of semi-coherent, often incoherent traditions that don't make much sense when all lumped together.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, I agree entirely with you. I think that it's, this is one of the reasons I have quite a bit of what Krister Stendahl called holy envy for traditions like Judaism. I've going back to my time at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, I remember a number of conversations around the dinner table, learning about how a lot of Jewish folks understand the scriptures not as this inerrant univocal constitution, but as an invitation to wrestle.
mhm.
And I think it's beautiful how that ties in with the conceptualization of Israel as, that wrestle with
Yeah,
God.
yes,
That was,
yeah, wrestling with
yeah.
God, yeah.
And
Except
so,
for God
and
cheated in that fight.
yeah,
We always love the
there was a
yeah, it's
little,
Yisrael. It's like you argue with fighting fights with God. I'm like, yeah, until God like pulls out the choke move or whatever and breaks your hip.
yeah.
I'm like, like kind of cheating God is this? Is this like old school 1980s wrestling days where they throw the
Yeah,
stuff in your eyes?
this is prison rules.
Yeah.
But I think that's such a wonderful approach. But I think because a lot of folks, and particularly Christians, are too mired in Christianity not as a means of self-improvement, but as a vehicle of power, that they want it to be, this perfect system. And when I made the video about the Immaculate Conception, and immediately I had a bunch of Protestants say, no, sin is inherited through the father, not through the mother. I'm like, you just made that up, just like they made up the original sin and the Immaculate Conception. You're not declaring any kind of objective truth. You're just saying this is the system that I prefer, because this is the credence that
Yeah.
I find social value, and I can.
Yeah, this is the thing. A bunch of people just straight up make up a whole bunch of BS, and oh my gosh, like imagine like thousands upon thousands of years, the amount of BS that people have made up, bro. But for the sake of this point, let's just talk about now today. People just make up a whole bunch of BS and just preach it, and then people believe it, and then when you tell them the actual facts, it's so hard to freaking get to their head.
Advance my own social standing using and endorsing. So,
Right. Yeah, it's very different to often people think that apologetics and cheerleading look very similar. And I'm like, I think that one can defend one's faith in logically consistent ways, but there is a moment where you just you're really cheerleading, like you're really just talking about how great your team is.
yeah,
There's not actually a there, and sometimes
yeah.
it's okay to cheerlead. I'm not opposed to cheerleaders, like, but that's not cheerleading is not a there's not a logical argument. It just like rah rah rah, my team is great. I'm like, you good. You should be happy for your team, but don't
which
confuse
is
that with a logical argument
yeah, which
or
is how
data.
I
Don't
which
yeah
is how I talk about Deutero Isaiah and what's going on
right.
there. And I think it's such, as much as a lot of people think that I'm denigrating the text or the authors of the text, that I'm criticizing them, but I think that what we have with I think three maybe four decisions made by authors of the biblical text, or at least intellectual authorities behind the biblical text, were probably some of the most influential decisions ever made by any human ever. I think the conflation of Adonai and El. I think Josiah's whatever you want to call it, propaganda. I think the universalization of Adonai, which I think occurs in the post-exilic period. I published a paper in the Journal of Biblical Literature about Psalm 82 as universalizing Adonai, and I think the rallying around Adonai as the primary identity marker that kept the Judean identity together through the exile, so that it survived and could come back and could become Judaism. I think those are probably four of the most influential decisions that have ever been made in the history of humanity. That leads, I think, that sets the table for and dovetails with the development of philosophy coming out of the classical world that allowed Adonai to be the one, the last deity standing, that was able to kind of join up with this Greek philosophical notion of deity and what it's supposed to be as the superlative and all this, giving us the God that the majority of the world worships today. And
But
so
I think it came out at a weird cost too, actually. I think I said this earlier before we were live, right? That I say sometimes that Yahwism went into exile and Judaism at some level came back.
yeah,
And I think that the trade that the Judeans made, the innovation came with a price. The universalizing of Yahweh came at the price that Yahweh ceased to be Yahweh, that we lost the warrior storm god.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
the original God, it was too parochial, and that in some sense Yahweh went extinct.
yeah,
Yahweh, that deity, the storm god of Seir, the maybe even the war god that Saul killed thousands and David killed tens of thousands, and Devorah praising like the massacres, and like that was a god that seems to have been the early kind of Yahweh at some level. That God was just like that was not ever going to be a God that was going to get a lot of traction
yeah,
as a universal deity. And in
right.
some sense, the universalizing meant the doom of Yahweh. And I sometimes say, no one's worshipped Yahweh, in 2,000 years, probably.
I I
Something
think
like that.
we see that that deity, I think, bubbling to the surface when somebody needs a I don't want I the word that keeps popping into my head is tribalistic, but
Sure. Yeah.
I don't, that's a problematic term. But when Christians or sometimes Jewish folks are getting like that, I think that's when that deity bubbles to the
Right. Yeah.
surface. The
It's when
God
you
that
when the
loves
land
their
grab.
people, yeah, and their land, and hates the other.
Yep.
And I think that's when the dinosaur DNA gets
Right.
injected, and we
Yeah.
get a little resurgence of that deity.
It's a
But yeah,
it's a
I
it's a
agree with that.
horrifying type of theological necromancy.
Yeah,
It's like you summon, this horrifying
yeah,
version, a primordial version that, it's Iron Age war band cults of 50 young guys killing each other
yeah,
over cattle or something. And now this becomes the grist for
yeah.
the mill of international politics. Chas v'shalom. Yeah, it is that is a moment where, yeah, this theological necromancy becomes truly terrifying.
But and I think the deity that sits down by the fire with Manoach and his wife, or walks with Abraham, or wrestles with Jacob, I think that's a far more interesting deity, and I
Mhm.
think a deity that it can also be far more inspiring than. And even when you get into the New Testament, in my opinion, and I don't know if you read my book, but I think that the logic of divine images is undergirding a lot of how they're rationalizing these intermediary figures
Mhm.
as exercising divine authority, but also manifesting the presence of the deity. And I think that's probably what Jesus was initially understood as, kind of a walking, talking divine image,
Right.
at
The
least as
what is it? Displaced presence is, I think, is how
well,
scholars
that's
talk
one
about
of
it,
the
right?
terms. Yeah, yeah,
Displaced presence.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
I,
could
I
certainly. Yeah,
I
go
I
ahead.
think but I think that's a far more interesting and inspirational deity than just arguing over whose deity can be more philosophically grandiose. And but that's
My
what we're
dad,
left with.
right? My dad can beat up your dad.
Yeah,
It's like, that's yeah. When all this theological speculation leaves us with my dad can beat up your dad. I'm like, we all have somehow reached great heights of theological and metaphysical rigor and regressed
yeah.
emotionally to being in middle school. And
It's
like,
just a cycle, I guess. Maybe we've
I
come
don't know.
around to the back end, and
Yeah, I don't
yeah.
know. Well, Dan, thank you so much for hanging out. It's been about an hour and a half, and I think we had like up about 800 people watching,
Awesome.
and I'm just one. I want to express my real appreciation to folks in the chat and folks who are watching. Really, really appreciate folks.
Well, is that the end?
Fantastic insights into.
Yeah, that's the end. Well, that was a good video. Very nice. I could listen to this if I had more time, more podcasts like this, but I'm a very busy person, which, like I said, there's going to be an announcement due to the fact that I'm going to be starting college regarding like long videos. I'm doing reactions to that. But anyways, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, bro, like make sure that you go and subscribe if you like my reactions, if you like my takes, if you like what I have to say. You know what I mean? You got any videos like this where you would love to see my reaction to? You would love to hear my take? You know, you could comment it in the comments below. Eventually, I will get to it. Wonderful video, excellent video, man. You know, thank you for watching. And goodbye, man. Check out my other videos on my channel like this.